Retirement was supposed to be peaceful, but when ex-detective Vic Holland clashed with HOA tyrant Karen Bennett, it ignited a war. She wanted control. He wanted her gone. She crossed the line. Now she'd pay. Victor Vic Holland had always imagined his retirement as a peaceful chapter of his life. After serving nearly 20 years as a detective in the Phoenix Police Department, he was more than ready to leave behind the late-night stakeouts, the bureaucracy, and the ever-present weight of unsolved cases. His idea of a perfect retirement was simple: buy a quiet home, tinker with his old cases as a private consultant, and enjoy his days with as little drama as possible. So, when he found a spacious property on the outskirts of a suburban community in Arizona, it felt like the perfect fit. The house was sturdy, the land was vast, and most importantly, it had a large, reinforced garage where he could securely store evidence and materials related to cold cases. Through a special arrangement with local law enforcement, Vic had been authorized to retain certain non-active police evidence, items that didn't belong in a standard archive, but were still valuable in ongoing private investigations. It wasn't a public facility, but a police-affiliated storage unit, and it was completely legal. Unfortunately, his newfound peace didn't last long. Enter Karen Bennett, the newly appointed head of the Homeowners Association, HOA. A woman in her early 50s with a razor-sharp bob, permanently furrowed brows, and an obsession with neighborhood aesthetics. Karen took it upon herself to enforce what she saw as proper suburban standards, whether or not they applied to Vic. It started subtly at first. A letter in the mailbox marked URGENTHOAVIOLATIONNOTICE, citing non-conforming exterior structures. A fancy way of saying she didn't like how his garage looked. Vic had dismissed it with a chuckle. His property wasn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction. Then, the warnings escalated. Knocks on the door. Passive-aggressive comments at the grocery store. More letters. "We have certain expectations here, Mr. Holland," Karen had said one afternoon, appearing at his doorstep with a clipboard and a smile that barely masked her condescension. "That garage is an eyesore, and we're also concerned about, well, what you keep in there." Vic had raised an eyebrow at that. "You mean my tools? My work?" Karen's smile had widened, her tone dripping with faux politeness. "Let's just say some of the neighbors have noticed things, coming and going at odd hours, mysterious deliveries. It all seems very concerning." That was when Vic realized something. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was digging for something. She wanted access to his garage, to pry, to control, and to dictate what he could or couldn't do on his own damn property. That was never going to happen. "Let me stop you right there," he had said, leaning against his door frame. "This is private property. I'm not in the HOA. And unless you have a warrant, you don't get to tell me what to do with my garage." Karen's lips had thinned at that. Her expression, for a fleeting moment, twisted into something uglier before she masked it with another artificially sweet smile. "Oh, I understand, Mr. Holland," she had said. "You just might not understand how things work around here." And with that, she had turned on her heel and left. Vic had watched her go, fully aware that this wasn't over. And he was right. Because what started as petty complaints and passive-aggressive warnings was about to spiral into full-blown warfare, one that Karen had no idea she was about to lose. The first official strike came just a few days later. Vic found another letter from the HOA shoved into his mailbox. This one stamped final notice in bold red letters. The contents were as ridiculous as expected. Failure to comply with HOA standards will result in fines of $500 per week until the violation is corrected. Vic chuckled, shaking his head. He wasn't a member of the HOA. He didn't owe them a dime. Still, out of curiosity, He made a call to his lawyer, just to confirm what he already knew. "You're in the clear, Vic," his lawyer assured him. "HOA has no jurisdiction over your property. They can't fine you. They can't enforce their rules. They're just trying to intimidate you." That's what he figured. But if Karen thought intimidation was enough to make him fold, she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Within days, the harassment escalated. First came the neighborhood patrols, groups of HOA members who suddenly felt the need to walk past his house multiple times a day, whispering and peering at his garage like it was some sort of crime scene. Then, his security cameras picked up Karen standing in his driveway, late one evening, clipboard in hand, writing something down. Trespassing. Then came the concerned neighbor reports, calls to the city, anonymous complaints about suspicious activity at his house. Twice, police officers showed up apologizing as soon as they saw him. "Sorry, Vic. Got another call about unregistered business operations. Some HOA nutjob filed a complaint." "Let me guess," Vic said dryly. "Karen?" "We can't say for sure, but yeah, it's Karen." Vic smirked. "I'll handle it." And he did. His response was swift and effective. First, he installed more cameras, including a high-definition one pointed directly at the street. Every single HOA patrol that passed by, every single time Karen just happened to be taking a walk, he got it all on video. Then, he sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA. Official, notarized, airtight. Any further harassment, trespassing, or false reports to law enforcement will be met with legal action. The next day, he got a furious email from Karen, full of legal-sounding nonsense about community responsibility and cooperation. He responded with one sentence: "Stay off my property, Karen." For a moment, there was silence. No patrols, no late-night clipboard checks, no fake complaints. But Vic knew better. Karen wasn't giving up. She was just getting started. The temporary silence lasted less than a week. Vic had seen enough power-hungry bureaucrats in his time to know that Karen wasn't the type to back down. If anything, she was regrouping, strategizing, plotting her next move. And when she struck, she didn't just escalate. She went nuclear. First came the surveillance tactics. Vic's security footage picked up a strange black SUV parked near his house at odd hours. It never stayed long, but it was clear someone was watching him. Then, he noticed a new camera installed on the street lamp across from his house, aimed directly at his driveway. A quick check of the HOA's online records confirmed his suspicion. Karen had used HOA funds to install community safety cameras, which just so happened to only monitor his property. He handled it the way any ex-cop would. He hacked into the live feed and replaced it with a loop of his empty driveway. Then, for good measure, he downloaded the HOA's security logs, ensuring he had evidence that they were illegally surveilling private property. Karen's next move was pure harassment. Out of nowhere, his trash bins disappeared. He found them 2 blocks away, stuffed behind an abandoned shed. His mail started arriving late, or not at all. A trip to the post office revealed that someone, probably Karen, had submitted a fraudulent address change request. He corrected it, filed a federal complaint for mail tampering, and set up a P.O. box. But the worst came at night. Bright floodlights suddenly appeared on 3 houses surrounding his property, angled directly at his windows. The moment the sun set, his entire house lit up like a damn crime scene. That one actually made him laugh. He installed blackout curtains, adjusted his cameras, and set up his own motion-triggered floodlight, one with a deafening siren attached. The first time Karen's little spies got blasted with 130 decibels of pure alarm, they nearly fell over each other trying to run away. And then there was the HOA's biggest stunt yet, an attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against him. One morning, Vic stepped outside to find bright yellow flyers taped to every door on his street. They read, "Attention, residents. A local homeowner is engaging in activities that violate the spirit of our community. Unlicensed business operations, unregulated storage, possible criminal elements at play." At the bottom was a pixelated photo of his garage, taken, Vic noted, from HOA's illegally installed security camera. That one pissed him off. He immediately gathered all the flyers and marched straight to the HOA's monthly meeting. The moment he stepped through the doors, every self-righteous board member froze mid-sentence. Karen, seated at the front with her signature smug look, didn't even flinch. "Mr. Holland," she said, all fake politeness. "I was wondering when you'd join us. We were just discussing—" Vic slammed the flyers onto the table. "Oh, I know what you were discussing, Karen. I just wanted to hear you say it out loud." A murmur rippled through the room. A few of the more spineless HOA members looked guilty, but Karen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "We're simply addressing neighborhood concerns," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "If you feel targeted, perhaps you should consider whether your activities are truly appropriate for this community." Vic grinned. "You mean like illegally surveilling a private citizen? Tampering with my mail? Stalking my property?" He pulled out a stack of photos, slapping them down one by one. Images of HOA members loitering near his house, screenshots of the hacked camera feed, timestamps of Karen snooping around his driveway. The room went silent. Karen's smug expression flickered for half a second before she recovered. "You have quite the imagination, Mr. Holland," she said, but her voice was noticeably stiffer now. Vic leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make sure only she could hear. "You just made two very big mistakes, Karen. You got sloppy, and you pissed off the wrong guy." Then he turned, walked out the door, and let the panic start to set in. But Karen wasn't done yet. Because the next time she struck, she wouldn't just harass him. She would break into his garage. Vic had expected Karen to retaliate, but even he was surprised by how far she was willing to go. After the HOA meeting, something shifted in the neighborhood. Karen's grip on her loyal supporters started slipping. The more rational homeowners, the ones who had blindly followed her lead, began realizing they'd been played. They weren't part of some noble suburban crusade. They were just pawns in Karen's personal war. Over the next few days, Vic noticed the shift. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now gave him small nods. Couple of them even apologized, admitting that Karen had twisted the truth. One man, Ted from 2 houses down, outright told Vic that Karen had pressured them into harassing him. "We thought we were enforcing community rules," Ted muttered. "But she's obsessed with you, man. It's personal for her." Vic simply nodded. He already knew that. But Karen? Karen didn't handle losing control well. That's why, 2 nights later, she made her move. The break-in happened at 2:17 a.m. Vic was out of town for a single weekend, attending a conference on private investigative techniques. His cameras, however, were very much active. The footage showed Karen and 2 of her most loyal HOA board members creeping up to his garage, dressed in dark clothing, clearly thinking they were pulling off the heist of the century. One of them, a balding man named Richard, pulled out a crowbar and started prying at the lock. Karen, standing behind him, smirked, arms crossed, like some kind of suburban mob boss. "Hurry up!" she hissed. We don't have all night." "Oh, this thing is solid," Richard grunted, struggling. "Then use the damn grinder," Karen snapped. That was when Vic's silent alarm triggered. Inside the garage, an infrared sensor tripped, sending a direct alert to Vic's phone. Miles away, sitting in his hotel room, Vic's eyes narrowed at the notification. He opened the live security feed and immediately saw Karen, her little crew, and the sparks from the grinder. A slow smile spread across his face. "Oh, Karen, you really messed up this time." Back at the scene, the lock finally gave way and the garage door creaked open. Karen stepped inside, her smug expression flickering to excitement. "Let's see what he's hiding," she muttered. They rummaged through boxes, knocking over carefully organized case files, flipping through documents, oblivious to the fact that they were handling police evidence. Then, Richard opened the wrong box. Inside was a sealed crate marked "Property of Phoenix PD, do not tamper." Karen's eyes widened. Inside, among neatly packed bags of evidence, sat a lineup of confiscated firearms. Karen froze. Richard took a step back. "Oh, shit," one of the other HOA members mumbled. But Karen, in her infinite arrogance, grinned like she had just hit the jackpot. "Gotcha," she whispered. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, believing she had finally found Vic's dirty little secret. And that was the moment the sirens started wailing. Red and blue lights flooded the street as 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of Vic's house. Officers piled out, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them!" Karen panicked. "Wait, what? No, this is a misunderstanding." Richard, ever the coward, tried to bolt, only to be tackled face first into the grass. Karen held up her hands, stammering, trying to twist the situation in her favor. I was investigating criminal activity," she blurted. "This man, he's a danger to the community." The officers weren't buying it. Because Vic had already called them. The moment he saw the break-in, he notified local law enforcement and sent them his real-time security feed. And now, Karen had just been caught breaking into a police-affiliated evidence locker. Vic's car pulled up just in time to watch her screaming at the officers, trying to spin her way out of trouble. As he stepped out, one of his newly turned allies, Ted, stood nearby, arms crossed, shaking his head. "Guess she went too far, huh?" Ted muttered. Vic grinned. "Oh, buddy. She has no idea how far she's gone." Karen stood in the flashing red and blue lights, her confidence cracking as the reality of the situation hit her. Officers swarmed the garage, methodically cataloging everything she and her cronies had disturbed. The sealed crate, the evidence bags, the firearms, items tied to ongoing police investigations. Her phone, which still displayed the half-snapped photos she had taken, was swiftly confiscated as evidence of her crime. "You don't understand!" Karen shrieked as an officer pulled her hands behind her back. "This man! He's hiding illegal materials! We were protecting the neighborhood!" Detective Mason, a tall, stone-faced officer who had worked with Vic back in the day, arched an unimpressed brow. "Protecting it? By breaking into a government-authorized facility?" he asked dryly. "By tampering with police evidence?" Karen flinched, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "That's ridiculous! How was I supposed to know it was police evidence?" she demanded. Vic stepped forward then, arms crossed, perfectly calm in contrast to her wild-eyed desperation. "I don't know, Karen," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe the giant official seals on the boxes, the do not tamper labels, the locked steel doors. Seems pretty obvious to me. Karen whipped toward him, her fury overtaking her panic for a brief moment. You set this up! She spat. You knew we'd come in here and... Oh, I knew, Vic admitted with a smirk. I just didn't think you'd be stupid enough to actually do it. Behind them, Richard and the other HOA board member sat cuffed on the curb, heads hanging low as officers took their statements. The remaining neighbors who had once supported Karen stood at a distance, watching in silent disbelief. Ted, standing beside Vic, shook his head in disgust. Jesus! Karen, what were you thinking? She whirled on him, rage boiling over. Oh, shut up, Ted! You were with me at first, she snapped. You all were! Don't act like you're saints now! But the tide had turned, and Karen knew it. The officer beside her cleared his throat. Karen Bennett, you are under arrest for breaking and entering, tampering with police evidence, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. You can't be serious, she shrieked. But the cuffs snapped around her wrist and reality finally hit. Karen Bennett was trapped in the very system she had once tried to manipulate, and no amount of HOA complaints was going to save her now. The courtroom was packed. It wasn't just a standard hearing, it had turned into a full-blown community event. Word had spread fast. The HOA president arrested for breaking into a police-affiliated garage, for tampering with actual evidence. Everyone wanted to see it unfold. Vic sat in the plaintiff's seat, arms crossed, calm as ever. On the other side of the room, Karen sat between her two lawyers, her face stretched tight in barely contained rage. Behind them, half the neighborhood had shown up. Sorrel, they weren't there for Karen, they were there for Vic. Ted and several other former HOA loyalists sat in the back, no longer the smug enforcers of community bylaws, but now witnesses against Karen. They had seen too much, been pushed too far. And when they realized the full extent of Karen's obsession, they flipped sides without hesitation. And then, of course, there was Richard, her right-hand lackey, who had already cut a plea deal. He sat a few seats away, looking pale and shaken, probably hoping to avoid a harsher sentence by selling Karen out. The judge, an older man with an air of absolute no-nonsense, cleared his throat. Let's proceed. Prosecution? Begin. Vic's lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Lisa Hammond, wasted no time. Your Honor, this is a clear-cut case of trespassing, evidence tampering, and malicious intent. We have multiple video recordings showing the defendant, Karen Bennett, and her associates breaking into Mr. Holland's garage, which, I should emphasize, serves as a police-affiliated storage facility. They had no warrant, no authority, and they knowingly violated private property laws. She gestured toward the large screen where Vic's security footage began to play. The jury watched in silence as Karen, smug and self-righteous, ordered Richard to break the lock. They watched her step inside, rifle through the evidence, and snap photos, her expression one of twisted victory, until the police sirens appeared in the frame. Then came the best part. Lisa clicked to the next clip, this time showing HOA members harassing Vic, shining lights at his windows, installing illegal surveillance cameras, and even tampering with his mail. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved a hand. No, let's see all of this, he said. If the HOA was involved in organized harassment, I want the full picture. Karen whipped toward her lawyer, hissing under her breath. Do something! But there was nothing to be done. When it was Karen's turn to defend herself, she rose dramatically, smoothing her expensive blazer as she strutted toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice taking on a sickly sweet tone, "I was simply acting in the best interest of our community. This man, Mr. Holland, has been operating under suspicious circumstances for months. I had every reason to believe he was breaking the law." Vic arched a brow, exchanging a glance with Lisa. "Best interest of the community?" Lisa repeated. "So breaking and entering is your definition of civic duty?" Karen flushed but pushed forward. "The HOA has the right to enforce standards. It's in our charter. We are legally entitled to investigate suspicious activity in the neighborhood." Lisa let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "please point to the section in your HOA charter that allows for breaking into private property." Karen's face darkened. "It's implied." "Implied?" Lisa cut her off. "You mean to tell me that the HOA, an organization meant to oversee property aesthetics, believes it has the power of law enforcement?" Karen gritted her teeth, her carefully rehearsed argument falling apart. And then, the final blow. Lisa stepped aside as Ted stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify," he said. Karen spun in her chair, eyes wide. "Ted, sit down!" But he didn't. "Karen manipulated us," Ted said, his voice loud and clear. "She made us believe we were doing the right thing. But all we were doing was following her personal vendetta against Mr. Holland. None of us wanted this. And the moment we questioned her, she turned on us too." One by one, other neighbors nodded in agreement. And just like that, the HOA collapsed like a house of cards. With Ted's testimony, and Richard turning state's witness, the HOA's corruption was fully exposed. More evidence surfaced. Misused funds, shady fines, bogus violations issued to homeowners who didn't support Karen. The judge rubbed his temples, exhaling heavily. "I've seen some ridiculous cases in my time, but this," he shook his head, "this takes the cake." Then he delivered the final verdict. Karen was convicted of breaking and entering, evidence tampering, harassment, and illegal surveillance. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, fined $50,000, and permanently banned from holding any leadership position in an HOA. The HOA itself? Completely dissolved. The neighborhood voted unanimously to disband it entirely, freeing themselves from Karen's tyrannical rule. Vic, meanwhile, was awarded damages, covering the legal fees and security upgrades he had been forced to install. As Karen was escorted out of the courtroom, she cast one last desperate look at her former allies, only to find that not a single person would meet her gaze. She had lost everything. And Vic? Vic had won. A month had passed since the trial, and the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. The absence of Karen's iron grip had transformed the once hostile environment. No more HOA spies patrolling the streets, no more pointless fines, no more neighbors whispering in fear of violating some unwritten rule. And Vic? Vic was thriving. That evening, as the Arizona sun dipped into shades of gold and crimson, he stood in his driveway, grilling steaks on a brand new barbecue, one that had been a gift from the neighbors. They had chipped in as a thank you for finally freeing them from Karen's reign of terror. Across the yard, Ted and a few others had gathered, beers in hand, laughing and chatting. The people who once blindly followed Karen had become friends, proving that some fights weren't just about winning, but about changing things for the better. And then, just as Vic flipped a steak, a familiar car crept down the street. Karen. She wasn't supposed to be in the neighborhood anymore. Her house had been sold off to pay fines, but there she was, sitting in the driver's seat of a cheap sedan, Her once pristine hair now a frazzled mess. Her once expensive clothes looking far less designer. She slowed in front of Vic's house, staring at the scene unfolding before her. The people she used to control, now happy and relaxed, without her. For a moment her face twisted in bitterness. "Vic?" He grinned. Slowly, he raised his beer in a mocking toast. Karen's face turned red, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. With a furious rev of the engine, she sped off, disappearing down the street, out of their lives for good. Ted let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You think she finally learned her lesson?" Vic took a sip of his beer, then chuckled. "Some people never learn, Ted, but at least she won't be our problem anymore." As laughter filled the air, Vic looked toward his garage, his evidence locker, his fortress, the symbol of his right to live on his own damn terms. The fight had been long and exhausting. But as he stood there, flipping steaks, drinking with friends, and watching the sunset over his property, his rules, his freedom, he knew it had been worth every second.